Cardiac ion channels. Ion channels are proteins that change shape in response to different stimuli to either allow or prevent the movement of specific ions across a membrane. They are said to be selectively permeable. Stimuli, which can either come from outside the cell or from within the cell, can include the binding of a specific molecule to a receptor on the channel, also known as ligand-gated ion channels, or a change in membrane potential around the channel, detected by a sensor, also known as voltage-gated ion channels, and can act to open or close the channel. The pore formed by an ion channel is aqueous, water-filled, and allows the ion to rapidly travel across the membrane. Ion channels can be selective for specific ions, so there are sodium ion, potassium ion, calcium ion, and chlorine ion specific channels. They can also be specific for a certain charge of ions, i.e. positive or negative. H, C, N channels. Hyperpolarization activated cyclic nucleotide gated channels, H, C, N, channels, are located mainly in pacemaker cells. These channels become active at very negative membrane potentials and allow for the passage of both sodium and potassium into the cell, which is a movement known as a funny current, IF. These poorly selective, cation, positively charged ions, channels conduct more current as the membrane potential becomes more negative, hyperpolarized. The activity of these channels in the sand cells causes the membrane potential to depolarize slowly, and so they are thought to be responsible for the pacemaker potential. Sympathetic nerves directly affect these channels, resulting in an increased heart rate, see below. The fast sodium channel. These sodium channels are voltage dependent, opening rapidly due to depolarization of the membrane, which usually occurs from neighboring cells, through gap junctions. They allow for a rapid flow of sodium into the cell, depolarizing the membrane completely and initiating an action potential. As the membrane potential increases, these channels then close and lock, become inactive. Due to the rapid influx sodium ions, steep phase zero in action potential waveform, activation and inactivation of these channels happens almost at exactly the same time. During the inactivation state, sodium ion cannot pass through absolute refractory period. However, they begin to recover from inactivation as the membrane potential becomes more negative, relative refractory period. Potassium channels. The two main types of potassium channels in cardiac cells are inward rectifiers and voltage-gated potassium channels. Inwardly rectifying potassium channels, K, I, R, favor the flow of potassium into the cell. This influx of potassium, however, is larger when the membrane potential is more negative than the equilibrium potential for potassium, about -90 mV. As the membrane potential becomes more positive, i.e. during cell stimulation from a neighboring cell, the flow of potassium into the cell via the K, I, R decreases. Therefore, K, I, R is responsible for maintaining the resting membrane potential and initiating the depolarization phase. However, as the membrane potential continues to become more positive, the channel begins to allow the passage of potassium out of the cell. This outward flow of potassium ions at the more positive membrane potentials means that the K, I, R can also aid the final stages of repolarization. Potassium channels. The voltage-gated potassium channels, K, V, are activated by depolarization. The currents produced by these channels include the transient out potassium current ITO1. This current has two components. Both components activate rapidly, but ITO fast inactivates more rapidly than ITO slow. These currents contribute to the early repolarization phase, phase 1, of the action potential. Another form of voltage-gated potassium channels are the delayed rectifier potassium channels. These channels carry potassium currents which are responsible for the plateau phase of the action potential, and are named based on the speed at which they activate, slowly activating I, K, S, rapidly activating I, K, R and ultra-rapidly activating I, K, R. Calcium channels. There are two voltage-gated calcium channels within cardiac muscle, L-type calcium channels, L for long-lasting, and T-type calcium channels, T for transient, i.e. short. L-type channels are more common and are most densely populated within the T-tubule membrane of ventricular cells, whereas the T-type channels are found mainly within atrial and pacemaker cells, but still to a lesser degree than L-type channels. These channels respond to voltage changes across the membrane differently. L-type channels are activated by more positive membrane potentials, take longer to open and remain open longer than T-type channels. This means that the T-type channels contribute more to depolarization, phase 0, whereas L-type channels contribute to the plateau, phase 2. Figure shows major currents during the contractile myocardiocite's action potential. I explained this earlier. Figure shows major currents during the cardiac pacemaker cell's action potential.